So we should get started because we have a large program ahead of us, and I am so thrilled. I think it must be the biggest program that we've had this year, so thank you very much for coming, and I'm glad that the invitation spoke to you and that you realised that it was you that we were hoping that would arrive this evening. It gives us great pleasure to introduce Dr. Fava Thomas, who's here from Fitchburg State University this evening. Dr. Thomas is a professor of history and she teaches modern Italian history and Italian-American immigration history. She holds a doctorate in history from Clark University. Her current research is on the impact of war on Italian civilians during both World Wars. She was recently awarded Fitchburg State University's 2017 Faculty Research and Scholarship Award. Her publications include The Reluctant Migrants, Migration from the Italian Veneto to Central Massachusetts, published by Teneo Press. And we have a copy at the library. And she has also done research on Columbus Day 1938 by Celebrate. And there are many, many other research papers that she has presented and been involved with, and they're all cited on her webpage as part of Fitchburg State University. But I think we're all interested and eager to get going with this program this evening, and I just couldn't be happier to introduce Dr. Fava Thomas to Southbridge. Thank you.
I was hoping for 3 or 4 people, so this is absolutely fabulous. So thank you for coming. I want to talk. I've got about 24 slides to go through, but feel free to ask a question, and when I get done, I'd like to leave some time so that people can ask questions and we can sort of have more of a conversation. So this is the town that's portrayed on the cover. It's Ravine Lago in the Veneto in northeastern Italy. It's a beautiful farming community, and a great number of people came from that place and settled in central Massachusetts. And I've spent a number of years trying to sort of track down their connections. Let's see if I can get a pointer here. Here we go. So we're up in the northeast area, and what you see is an area that near Venezia, which is the city of Venice, of course. It's flat, beautiful farmland, plenty of rivers draining it, but it very quickly becomes steep and very mountainous. And the area where Ravine Lago is halfway between Treviso and Belluno, up in the mountains. And this gives you an idea of what life is like up there. People still farm. You can't use tractors. The hillsides are so steep. This person has cut hay, and the woven device is called a gurla. Very often women use those to carry the hay down from the mountainsides. They also use it when they go out into the fields to do harvesting. The sort of shady item on the left that looks like a cone is the way that they bale hay. They actually build it up into these conical structures for storage. So, traditional life before migration began. Small family farms in the mountains, independent landowners. Most of the people up here owned their own property, farmed it, and were essentially self-sufficient. It was not difficult to make a living. You could cut hay, raise grapes, make wine, make grappa. My grandparents did. Corn, beans, fruits, chestnut trees. So you're talking about a well-rounded diet, plenty of meat. A lot of women would be responsible for an area around the house called a cortile, where they would have rabbits or turkeys, small animals that were raised for food. You'll notice there's not a whole lot of like beef farming or anything like that. Hunting, fishing. There are 2 beautiful lakes in that area. There are wild boar if you're brave enough to go after them. Men, women, children did the field labor. Women work as hard as men. Most of the tools, most of the equipment is completely handmade in the 1870s. So you're talking about a world that's basically agrarian. that's comfortable, that's independent. But that begins to change by the 1880s. So what did change? In 1870, Italian unification, the political unification of Rome, with Rome as the capital of the entire peninsula, leads to a number of developments, but especially economic development. Investors begin to buy up small farms. Small farmers are forced into becoming essentially what we would probably refer to in the United States as tenant farmers. People who work, they sometimes call them bracciante, they're arms. They're getting paid for day labor. The other thing is, as the 1880s develop, the Italian government in Rome begins to fund what were called bonifica, irrigation projects, hydro projects that dam up waterways and encourage people to conduct large-scale one-crop agriculture. This is something independent farmers couldn't compete with. In other words, they're building a world that's more modern, and in Italy that's more unified, but the ironic thing is it's making life difficult for the small farmer. So large-scale one-crop agriculture, temporary day labor. You get hired when they need you, and then they let you go, and then you get hired when it's harvest time. So there's nothing that you can depend on. By 1881, only 11 years after unification, a group called the GCD Commission is put together, and their goal is to study what's wrong in Italy and why Italians want to leave. And the number one problem is temporary day labor. Not enough income to survive. 30 to 50 centimes a day is essentially what we would call a half a dollar or a half a lira. It's not enough money to live on. And this is a problem that affects not just northeast Italy, but all of Italy. And as you go further south, particularly when you get to the island of Sicily, in these years, money becomes very, very difficult to come by. And the irony is that temporary day laborers are really having a difficult life. Farmers who had lived on a varied diet begin to live on polenta and beans. Now, polenta is delicious if your family makes it and you have, you know, some nice meat on the side, or they fry it in butter. But if it's polenta and beans for breakfast and for dinner and nothing else, you are not getting enough protein in your diet. You're not getting enough variety. The other thing is, by 1881, they're grinding cornmeal in such a way that it kills the niacin in it. So, diseases, particularly pellagra, begin to spread and become a real problem in Italy. The highest rates in this region, stunted growth, stunted mental development. You had people who were drafted and the Italian military couldn't take them because they really weren't tall enough or strong enough to bear arms. Poor housing. People who couldn't have a home of their own or land of their own begin building sort of lean-to structures, almost going back to ancient times when they lived near the lakes with homes made out of reeds. Malaria, cholera, typhoid, and it's a situation that people are simply going to try and flee from. So in terms of immigration history, when you're looking at a region or you're looking at a country, in any time frame you start to examine what are the push factors, what's driving people out, but also what are the pull factors, what attracts people to a certain place. So I want to talk first about the push factors, some of which we've already discussed, but also what was attracting people to central Massachusetts. So push factors. Driven by hardship, everything we've talked about, economic changes that equal hunger, crash in farm prices, laborers could not survive. They went to large one-crop agriculture. About the same time, America was exporting grain. American grain exports began to crash farm prices throughout Europe. So, you know, the settling of the West and all of this spread out in that area begins to have real consequences. Strikes and violence. La Bohe, the boiling over, talks about describes the violence that comes out of this era. farm workers who aren't getting paid. If you look at wages all the way across Europe, and this goes from the 1880s to about 1960, the lowest wages paid anywhere in Europe were in Italy. And it's not until like Fiat in the early 1960s where wages actually become equal with some other places. So this violence, there are a lot of people who simply don't want to live in a place where there is the chance of violence and repression, and strikes don't result in significant economic change. So what kind of ways do you deal with this? A lot of people don't want to be pushed out. They like to maintain a life there, and they begin doing essentially seasonal migration. A lot of the people who came here, we think of, you know, the American dream. They came here, they settled here, and they never went back. Some people migrated yearly. It's essentially like commuting, but in a much larger sort of yearly concept. If you were offered work that was pick and shovel work, if you were working on construction, you wouldn't have anything to do in the winter, and it would be much better to buy a cheap steamer ticket and go home and come back the next spring. You could essentially have two lives. What historians like Donna Gabaccia call the transnational life. You're living on both sides of the Atlantic. You travel, you have a network of friends and relatives. You might get back to your home village in the Veneto and hear from friends that there's a better job in another place. You might be working in Chicago one summer and in Massachusetts another. So these networks allow people to sort of share information. If you looked at Southbridge Italians or Fitchburg Italians, you probably would find when they first came that they went into the same boarding houses. And they would tend to meet in those boarding houses, exchange information, and then gradually develop networks where they lived in apartments together as groups. Pull factors. This is Fitchburg in a nutshell. If you look in the foreground, closest to you, you can see a couple of the biggest textile mills. There's the Arden Mills, Fitchburg Yarn, so they have cotton, wool. Further around to the west, there's a mill that did cotton duck for military purposes. If you look, you're looking actually over the Nashua River, and what you're seeing in the distance, that big hill is Rollstone Hill, which had not one but 5 quarries on top of it, so there were plenty of different jobs. A lot of northern Italians were stone cutters. If you cut stone in the mountains, you're cutting tufa stone. And you know, I've been up there, and you can actually go up to the side of a wall and break a piece of it off. It almost looks like chalk. It's very soft. That whole mountain is granite, and it's really tough. It is very difficult to cut stone up there. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But people would come, settle in that neighborhood around Rollstone Hill. It's a mixed neighborhood. It's Italians, it's people from a variety of other places, French Canadians, Irish, Russians, from all sorts of places. You could work up in the quarries, or, and very often, particularly for Italian women, they would look for jobs spinning in the factories. So here you had a mix of both genders coming and a variety of ages, and it's essentially tenement life. One of the other big attractions, and this is something that is only for about a decade, but it was a terrific opportunity to earn wages if you were a stone cutter or willing to do hard physical labor. The Wachusett Dam project in Clinton. This is showing the dam going up. You can see the derricks up on the top. So if you're interested in this, by the way, or if you have any connection to that project, there is a fabulous website called Digital Commonwealth, and the Department of Conservation and Recreation has posted hundreds of glass plate negatives from that, and this is reproduced from their website.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
Is there a list of workers that went and did the dams that came from Italy?
You can, matter of fact, I'll tell you in 1 minute, there was residents, and I'm putting residents in quotes, when you see the picture you'll know why. That was very crude, but they were there at the time the US government did the census. I think it was 1910, because I think the project finished in like 1914.
Yeah.
That is one way to record this. However, in conversations with the DCR, when the workers arrived there, they didn't want to deal with names. They gave them numbers. And they actually put the number on the jacket, and they would refer to them by number. So, you know, on the one hand, yeah, the US Census got them at one point, but for the other hand, a lot of it is nameless.
My grandfather worked on the dam. That's why,
So did mine.
that's why I
I'm
came here.
Trying to figure out, because
Yeah.
my mother's side, they lived in West Boylston. But my father's side came from Italy. And they're connecting to Sterling, West Boylston, so, and they came around the time that this was built, so that's what I'm trying to.
My
You'll blow my
great-grandfather
father's
came here, and he left my grandmother was a very small child, and she stayed here with family, and he went back because he was injured on the dam project. A lot of people were. But let me get to the pictures, and I'll be happy to give you some advice afterwards on how to look at some of the census stuff. The Wachusett Dam, 1896 to 1906. Clear the land and trees. Italians did stonework. They did some of the pick and shovel work. African-American labor did most of the digging. They had to create 118 square miles of watershed. Scientific American, at the turn of the century, came there and did an examination of it and determined it was probably the second largest hand-dug dam project in the world. So this is sort of like just before you go to mechanical construction work. Okay, temporary huts, boarding, and a commissary. That's where some people live. Okay, hence, they didn't have an address. This is actually the area that was detailed by the census. They had commissary buildings, but there is a specific reason why the people who ran the dam project refused to let them move into permanent housing. If you made enough money, you could live in an apartment. That was your free will. But if they were housing you, areas around these big projects did not want immigrants to stay in any kind of permanent building. So whether you're talking about this or the same company that built this one did the Croton Dam project in New York, and it was written directly in the contract, they could not build anything permanent that they could live in. Because they wanted, when the dam project was done, they wanted them to leave. If you go up on the DCR site, there's even more pictures, but it was sort of like, I thought this kind of covered the whole squalor part of it. They're very grim. They literally look like the structures that Northern Italians built around the lakes. They have sort of recreated them in a museum, and then you're talking about like the Bronze Age. And they did, it was reconstruction. It's sort of like they've gone back to that for here. Many of these people were here for most of the dam project. Earlier I was talking about the networks. When they didn't pay them for 2 months at the end of one season, the next season nobody showed up because the word had passed. So people began to move in other places. The Rollstone Quarry was primarily the destination for many of these people. Triple deckers. You know, if you're from central Massachusetts, you know what this is. A cold flat, storm windows, kerosene, wood, coal stoves, backyards, chickens, rabbits. Essentially, you're beginning to recreate something similar. Very few migrants changed their last names. They wanted to hold on to that. But you often have a real problem with your employers. They don't want to try to pronounce an Italian name. Or they want to shorten it, or they want to do something to it. The Rollstone Hill, this is the quarry. If you look closely, you can see there are people walking in between those stones. They did blasting, they lift the rocks with heavy derricks, they moved hundreds of tons of granite per day out of there. Unfortunately, the difference between tufa stone in northeast Italy and granite is that if you saw up granite, you're much more likely to get silicosis, lung disease. It was very dangerous work. One of the quarries on Rollstone Hill was called the Shea Quarry. And the son of the guy who ran it left a little memoir, an oral history in the Fitchburg Historical Society. And when I read through it, he went right to the subject of names. And he said, we didn't want to pronounce the names. He said they were Italians, and they actually sort of brought it out that way. And they said, we changed everybody's name. One guy was from Rome, so they named him Mike Rome. They took other people's names and just sort of simplified it. And he said that lasted until FDR passed Social Security, at which they all had to be legal, and they all had to have Social Security numbers, so they had to get the names right. So the issue of trying to hold on to your name through all of this was difficult. So risks. If you're working in what was then called Machine City, which was Fitchburg, blasting, cutting stones, silicosis. The Goodnow Foundry, Independent Lock, ILCO. They worked with molten metals. Very few of these factories had the proper ventilation, and people absorb the heavy metals, and they get something called brass chills. So you could work in a foundry for about a year and a half, and then you'd have to take another job and get away from it for a while because it would cause all kinds of problems. Textiles, asthma. Paper mills, the humidity. If you got a job at Fitchburg Steam Engine, you were a machinist, the Dillon Boiler Works, you really had it made. Okay, maybe it's risky, but it was probably the paper mills and the steam engine works were the two places people aimed for. Tenement life, tuberculosis. One of Massachusetts' first TB programs was in Fitchburg. Typhoid outbreaks, bacterial diseases. When you crowd lots of people into tenements, sharing beds, etc., these kind of things happen. This is a photograph on the left of what was called an iron mic. And if you look closely, you can see that the drinking cup is attached. And there are a lot of reasons why that isn't a good idea. Fitchburg removed all of the cups when they had the 1910 typhoid outbreak. It killed 3 cotton mill workers. They had the Massachusetts Board of Health in the city trying to determine what was wrong. What they eventually found out was there were signs that said non-potable water and drinking water. However, most of the people, whether they were Italians or not, couldn't read English. Hence, they were drinking from water that hadn't come from the drinking system in Fitchburg. So, one of the key questions is, how do people learn English? And I want to sort of transfer over and talk about the assimilation of these people, how they learned English, how they became citizens. One of the leaders of this began a program in Fitchburg, Mayor Frederick Fosdick. He and his brother owned one of the largest companies, the Fitchburg Steam Engine Works. He was the mayor of the city, and his daughter was the librarian in town, or at least one of the library staff. Fitchburg has a large library, much like Southbridge. He helped develop a YMCA school for citizenship. His daughter, Margaret, became one of the key persons teaching Italians English, and of course, other ethnic people. If you look at Fitchburg's population, it steadily rises during the years of immigration from 1880 to 1920. The population in 1895 was over 26,000. 34% of the population was foreign-born. Another 38% was the children of foreign-born. So you're talking close to 3/4 of Fitchburg's population was immigrant or the children of. This is a postcard of the YMCA building downtown where you could go and have some aid in learning. But there are other heroes to this story, so let's look at the downside first. Massachusetts wasn't the best place to be an Italian immigrant in the 1920s. The Immigration Restriction League, which was a national organization that lobbied Congress and helped get restrictive legislation through Congress, was based right in Boston. The Dillingham Commission in Congress studied the immigrant impact on U.S. skilled labor. They called in a number of people. Many of them were representatives or connected with the IRL. So the Dillingham Commission finally issues a 41-volume report in which they're critical of unskilled labor, illiterate labor, and specifically Italians. Now, I'm not saying that they dropped everything entirely on Italians, but they focused on it to the point where they gave Ellis Island inspectors specific questions to focus on with Italians. 1922, Sacco and Vanzetti, the trial, and then the appeals. During the Coolidge administration, everything comes to a head. What the IRL gives as testimony, what the Dillingham Commission makes part of the congressional record, finally comes home to roost. Why in the 1920s? With the end of World War I in 1918, large numbers of people, not just Italians, were seeking to leave what had been war-torn Europe. They were looking to start fresh. The Americans were looking to basically slam the door. The federal quota acts cut it down to 3% of the old immigration numbers and eventually to 2%. That meant if you took the number for 100% of Italian immigration in a specific year, it was something like 1900. They would only allow 2% of that in. They eventually got the number down to just over 3,800. So if you tried to migrate in the 1920s, it was much harder to get in. You had to prove you were literate, etc. The 1927 Sacco and Vanzetti executions, the rise of Mussolini and fascism. You can see that there's sort of problems on the horizon. You have an active Italian club here, and that's really wonderful. I want to look at some of the institutions that were built in the Fitchburg area. St. Anthony's Church was the first all-Italian church north of Worcester. It was built in 1908. The Italians raised the money. They hired a priest. They got the Venerini sisters over a few years after that from Viterbo, Italy. So they had an elementary school. They had evening classes for women. Mutual societies, known as Mutual Soccorso, were essentially self-insurance. If you couldn't afford medical care, people in workplaces would gather together or in clubs, chip in some money, and use that sometimes to hire a doctor to take care of people, or to, in the unfortunate circumstance, somebody got killed in the quarry or in a factory, provide them with some small life insurance to the widow. The Venetian Club. My grandfather belonged to it, my uncle belonged to it. I can't find a single person or a record of it. I can tell you there was one. I can't tell you anything about it. The Marconi Club is alive and well, and it's right near the church, so if you go to the church, you can go to the Marconi Club by basically walking across the street. The Carlo Alberto Society is a very sophisticated name. Carlo Alberto was the king who tried to drive the Austrians out of northern Italy in the 1830s. He is forgotten by just about every single person in Italy, except for my grandfather who formed that club, which was him and, as far as I can tell, about 6 of his friends who played cards and had a wonderful political sounding name, but it was basically a place to get together, have a meal, and enjoy an afternoon away from the family. Okay, sports. Second generation. Now, the first generation enjoys traditional sports. They had bocce courts in their backyard. I'm hearing a lot about bocce here. A lot of the second generation goes into baseball and bowling, especially candlepin bowling. It's very popular. There were a number of lanes in Fitchburg, and Italians became owners of those. So this is really a way to get into the business of America. And for Italians, there is a guy named John Tagg, whose original name was Nino Tagliaferro, who built a number of lanes and was the house pro and was evidently really good at it, to the point where he once took a $200 bet to beat a guy at candlepin bowling, and did. First Fitchburg High graduates. Sometimes there's a question about how many families would allow women to go to school, and especially to high school. The first Italian-American female graduate of Fitchburg High was Mary Constantino, who graduated in 1903, and that's early for anybody, because most people got what we would call a 7th or 8th grade education, and that was considered pretty good in that time frame. Fitchburg's Office of Americanization. Now I want to connect the two threads we've talked about. We talked about how people came here, built organizations, but there were concerns about literacy, about learning, working in the job market, and with some English skills. The Office of Americanization was set up not just to help people learn English, but specifically to move them towards the citizenship exams. It was headed by Margaret Keelty, who was the daughter of a pharmacist. They had a lot of Italian customers, and she was fluent in Italian. She had mother's classes. She worked in the public school system. She read about a British scholar who claimed that an immigrant could learn 850 words and be functional in English. She wrote a textbook that could be used not just in the Fitchburg schools, it was published nationally, and was used essentially to give you the language for the workplace, for the community. And Keelty decided to really prove it. She had the press come to meet her to discuss her book, and when the guy finished his article, she asked him if he would please give it to her. And she retranslated it by boiling it down into the 850-word vocabulary, and they printed it in the Fitchburg Sentinel as an example that you really could use only 850 words and survive in English. When I go to Italy, I wish I could get away with that small vocabulary. It just doesn't work. But Keelty becomes the spearhead for nearly 2 decades for getting people naturalized. Now, what was she fighting? By 1938, she was going out with the priests, Father Capuano and Father Mastrangelo, from St. Anthony's, and saying, you really need to get naturalized. And there were a lot of older people who were very reluctant to do that. Most of the young people, if you were born here, of course, if you didn't have a problem, but most of the people who had done it had already done it. By the time you're elderly, the idea of English language classes is a little daunting. However, in 1940, because of Mussolini, Italians became not aliens, but enemy aliens if you had not been naturalized. On the right is a picture of the alien registration card. You were fingerprinted, you were photographed, you had your physical description, and you were given a set of instructions. If you could flip that card over visually, you would see you could not have a shortwave radio, and by that they meant, this is before television, you had a radio in your home. Many immigrants, whether they're Italian or from some other group, had radios that could get 2 different bands, and they could actually listen to shortwave broadcasts from other countries. They actually would come into your house, clip the wires, and remove the shortwave portion of it, and then you could listen to Bob Hope for the rest of the time. No entry into military zone supports. That meant if you lived in Boston, any place where military ships might be harbored, San Francisco, you could not have a camera or a gun. And for people who were used to hunting and fishing, that's really a sacrifice. You could not make any airplane travel, and you were under a 10 o'clock curfew. Approximately 600,000 Italian aliens in the United States fell under this. Keelty recorded 374 in Fitchburg. She had made a really good effort to try to get them registered. Now we're going to, all of the class has to take a test and tell me who the guy is on the left.
Joe DiMaggio.
Okay.
Right.
That's Joe DiMaggio and his parents. When Roosevelt was asked about Italians, he wasn't worried. He regarded them as, quote unquote, a bunch of opera singers, which sort of is flattering. But in 1940, the FBI drew up the custodial detention list. They were looking specifically for people who did radio broadcasts, who taught languages in the schools, and who might be politically active, and especially any Italians who ran newspapers or wrote for them. Anybody who could communicate. Ezio Pinza got rounded up and put on Ellis Island for a while until his wife and some lawyers managed to spring him. But this was quite serious. They did arrest people in the Fitchburg-Leominster area, but a small number. The only thing I've ever been able to find out is they arrested 2 people in Leominster. There's no idea what the cause was or who they were. So, FDR's proclamation 9066, all alien enemies were now subject to arrest and internment. Of course, everybody's familiar with the Japanese internment on the West Coast. The Italian internment ended in October of 1942 on Columbus Day when the Attorney General gave a speech ending enemy alien status for Italians only. Now, why did they do it then? They might be celebrating Columbus Day, but what in fact had happened is FDR had a guest come into his office and explain to him he was a New York State politician. And he said, the Senate elections are coming up in November of 42, and you're going to lose New York. And then he asked him 2 rhetorical questions. What happens when you put Joe DiMaggio's parents in an internment camp? And the second question was New York-based. What happens when you put Frank Sinatra's parents in an internment camp? Wow. Hence, end of alien status. Now, let's take a look at what Italian Americans from Fitchburg did in the war. 600 men and women in service. 14 killed in the Second World War. I tracked down every one of them. They died in every theater of war. One guy was in the U.S. Navy Air, and he was killed off the coast of Brazil. You had people killed at Monte Cassino, in France, in the Pacific, everywhere. Army Corporal Leonard Lanzelotti negotiated the surrender of a fortified Nazi position in Aachen, Germany. This is actually a photograph of the people being marched out. He was later captured in the Hurtingen Forest and himself, ironically, became a POW. He won the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, Combat Infantryman's Badge, and came home 70 pounds less than he was. He actually had joined the military in 1935. So he'd been in for a long time. And he remained. He was career military. Staff Sergeant Maria Battistella was in charge of evacuating people home. She was a medical specialist. She analyzed who needed to be in a military hospital there and what cases were so serious they had to be moved back to to Massachusetts. However, Fitchburg put her on the front page when she was photographed serving in the wax when they did a victory parade in Paris down the Champs-Élysées in 1945. So they were quite proud of the Italians at the end of the war. So let's take a look at one last thing. The biggest question is, how do you preserve the old neighborhood? How do you keep the second generation, the third generation close enough that the church doesn't get consolidated, which was really a threat for St. Anthony's. Fortunately, they survived it. The Belmont Street development was the brainchild of the priests in the 1950s. They saw they were losing parishioners to suburbia. They expanded into a new elementary school. They bought a piece of open land not far from the church, carved it up into house lots, set up their own development corporation. I mean, I can't imagine how ambitious this must have been. The only rule was, you can buy a house, but one person's got to be Italian or Italian American. They were low cost, they were nice houses. My dad's oldest brother bought one. And then, as people still moved out, they built a satellite church out in the suburbs, the Madonna of Holy Rosary. So that's the finish to this, but I want to give Fitchburg State one quick plug. We have a study abroad program, so if your kids come to Fitchburg State, You can study abroad in Verona. In 2009, I taught there. It was absolutely a blast. I taught a course on modern Italian history in Italy, which it doesn't get any better than that. We have an adult learners program in the Fitchburg area, Alpha, afternoon enrichment course. You don't have to do homework. I'm teaching Italian-American history in the spring. It's 5 sessions, an hour and a half in the late afternoons. Center stage program, music, art, performances. We're having a dinner. We're going to have a person who's an expert on opera named Fred Plotkin come and give a talk, and at the same time you get a nice feed. It's a wonderful evening out. The Amelia Gallucci Cheerio Library, we have one incredibly generous alumna. She's passed away, but she left a wonderful legacy. She left us funding to support study abroad, a Center for Italian Culture. It buys music, videos. It has sponsored the composition by an Italian-American artist of Venetian music. And we are hoping to have organized, the date is yet to be announced, in April, an Italian-American History and Language Conference, not just for people who are interested in history and language, but for teachers, particularly people who are involved in teaching in the public schools. So that's where we are. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions. Sure.
Are there actually any Italian internment camps around here?
No. If you were interned, as far as I know, the closest internment was Ellis Island. However, there is the possibility, although I couldn't answer for sure, there was in East Boston an immigration depot, which a lot of Italians came through on the way in, mostly in the 20th century. It's past the early days of Ellis Island. And if they were going to hold somebody, it might be out there. I don't know where the people who were picked up by the FBI from Leominster were. I don't know anything about them. In fact, the U.S. government kept the records closed until, I'd say, the late 1990s, because there were a couple of congressmen who were of Italian-American heritage and said, these files have to be released. And they did. And they actually listed some of the people who had been on the custodial detention list, but they don't tell you who was arrested or anything else. Ezio Pinza, the only reason that is, it's because he was so famous.
Celebrity, yeah.
We know specifically who he was.
Yeah.
But families tended to be very, very quiet about this. They would not tell you. I've had people tell me that, gee, my grandparents weren't naturalized and they didn't carry ID cards, and then they later find out if they talk to people that, yeah, in fact, they did.
Do they have any long-term internments in the community?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. And fortunately for Italians, it's about 2 years. For other ethnic groups, it was longer. But the odd thing is the focus on people who taught language and things, and who were radio broadcasters, because there's a great book, and I'm not going to pull up the name right now off the top of my head, but the whole program and oral histories from it, because when they couldn't get into the documents, they interviewed people who had survived it. But a lot of that story is about what happened on the West Coast. And one of the big stories was Joe DiMaggio, because he actually bought a restaurant in San Francisco on some pier, and his father couldn't walk into the restaurant because it was a military restricted area, because it was part of the port.
Yes.
And that was yet another part of the story that made it so sort of infamous. It's a painful period of Italian American history.
There were, during the war, shortly after, there were camps for prisoners that they sent back from Europe, Italian and German prisoners
Yes.
in the United States.
Yeah, they were. And I don't know about the ones in the East Coast, but I do know that they did have prisoner of war camps in California. That's true. Other question? Yeah.
Oh, I was waving at someone, but
Okay.
since you called on me anyway, my father does recall back during that time that if you have an Italian last name, you could have a really hard time finding a job. Even in Leominster, and particularly from Leominster, which was heavily Italian. The Nina signs, no Irish need apply, also Italian, meant no Italians need apply. Yeah.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that comparison before, but it fits.
I do know there was a POW camp up in Princeton, Maine. My brother was up in Princeton, Maine. It was part of it was part of the POW. I don't know what war it was.
Okay. During World War I, they had POWs on Fort Devens. But I don't think they had them during World War II. But I don't know that for sure.
He's looking into it because
Yeah.
he's had a historical site. And he says, you'd be
Ah.
interested to know.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Many of the people from Southbridge are from, name it,
Palestrina.
Palestrina. And
Palestrina.
rumor has it that you've been there and you've met some of them. Can you tell us about
Yes.
that?
It's an absolutely beautiful place. And it's set up on a mountain. And the Ciprari family are absolutely wonderful because I went to dinner twice at their restaurant. They were very, very friendly. This is a town that's very much like Ravine that you saw at the beginning. Let me just escape out of this. And let me see. I thought maybe I could show you a couple pictures. I use this for, I teach a course on travel in Italy, and I loaded the slides up. So if you see, it's the same kind of mountain. It's a beautiful area. That's actually the public library is behind that gate, believe it or not. It's small, but it's nice. And that is the Porta del Sol. That is the Sun Gate. When you walk into the city, you're coming up through the ancient part of the city. The area you see on your left is being reconstructed. That was the government of Italy has funded the preservation of much of the town. And they actually drive through those streets, but they have really small cars. And when you're walking down the street, you feel, you constantly, you walk and then you flatten yourself and get slow, and then you walk and then you flatten yourself and get slow. And it's fun because if you go out at night, they have a beautiful cafe. Okay, I'm reliving Italian life here. It's just hard to just get into it. But this is some of their signage. They have a lot of information. This is Palestrina. His real name is Giuseppe, and I'm not going to remember what it is, but he's D. Palestrina of Palestrina. He's a famous musician, which is how I came here. I was working on a project with another scholar at Fitchburg State on Venetian music, and he wanted to have 3 Venetians and Palestrina. And this is the Duomo, or the cathedral in the city, which was bombed by the Allies. There is a lot of damage in the city. These are the bronze gates. And this says, in memory of the 91 victims of the air bombardment of the 22nd of January 1944, the commune remains against war and hopes for the multiplication of peace. And even the police cruisers are small.
You're right.
But take a look at the house. It's white on one side, it's old stone on the other. They rebuilt the buildings which were bombed because they had to salvage everything. This is an example of they had to preserve what they could. I've been reading the city records this past summer about what happened in the city and how they rebuilt. They had no sewage system, no lighting system, no electricity, anything. The Nazis had a communication center at the top of the city, on the top of the mountain. And that's what the Americans were after, to bomb it. Unfortunately, on one of their bombing runs to destroy a place called Valmontaigne, they got lost. I don't know if it was the fog or what. 37 of the crew said they hit Valmontaigne. One guy said he thought they hit something else, and what it was Palestrina.
What area is this?
This is just outside Rome. If you hop on a bus, it's about a 23-mile bus ride, so it's not that bad. If you're visiting Rome, it's not far.
North?
Yeah, the ironic thing is I went there and I figured nobody back in Venice when I arrived back there would know about it. And I talked to a couple of people and they were like, oh yeah, Palestrina, I went there, it was beautiful. Oh yeah, Palestrina, I went there, it was great. We were on vacation there, we went to see the museum. It was developed because the bombing actually exposed some of the structures that were there that are Roman.
That's right.
That when they reconstructed that, they've opened it as a museum. Scholars go there. By 1955, 1956, it became a real destination. There's a whole bunch of articles that have been published about it and about its history. So, You got a little added. It is a beautiful place. Good luck. Buona fortuna.
Before people depart, could I just ask that anybody who'd like would put their name on the list, because this talk is presented as part of the Last Green Valleys Walktober series, and we are connected, as you know, all the way down through Norwich, Connecticut, and they like to do a census of who's here. So we will count the number of people, but if you want to give your name and email address and be included in maybe some correspondence from them, please add your name to the list. And before we finish this evening, I would like to say how grateful I am to Dr. Fava Thomas for coming all the way from Fitchburg. And it wasn't just one visit. She prepared for her talk by coming a week previously, and we had many correspondences as well. And it was just great. I'm just so delighted to be working with somebody who really took an interest in our community as much as her own community and like the community of her research focus. And it's just wonderful. And maybe at some stage she might be interested in doing some, research on Southbridge area and maybe Southbridge immigrants here and the Italian community. And I would just like to say how grateful I am for people for coming tonight. It was a bad evening and people just came out, and I would like to add that I think it's the Italian Club that helped us get our message out. So thank you very much. And, just to mention that we will have some more maybe talks coming up. Our calendar is online, but there is a couple of things that I'd just like to quickly mention that may have particular interest. One is in November we will be doing the ABCs of opera, and as we've heard mentioned there that the Italians are associated with opera, so maybe that's something that would interest you. So that's going to be, I think, the 15th of November. And then later in December, we have Joseph Lenti, Dr. Joseph Lenti, who is from Southbridge, but who has gone on to bigger and greater things in Washington State. He has just written a book on the Mexican Revolution and will be back in Southbridge and has agreed to present a talk here on it. And his book will be available for sale. So if you're thinking about Christmas gifts, maybe that's something that you might like to do. And the author will sign the books as well. So thank you very much for your attention. This talk is recorded, so it will be up on YouTube on our playlist, so you'll be able to get it there for anybody who may have missed this evening. And thank you again sincerely to Dr. Thomas for coming all this way. Thank you.